Hello and welcome to another episode of Laptop Retrospective, and this is probably a different format. I don't normally start with the laptop open, but I think this is where our discussion for this needs to start. So this is the ASUS K571G, and this was a chassis that was released around the year 2020. Now, information on these machines is not exactly easy to find. I think they were released in a handful of markets, and the system specs are very, very difficult to nail down, and we'll get to that right away. It is a 15.6-inch laptop, 1920 by 1080 screen, 250 nits, and unfortunately only a 45% NTSC color accuracy. In terms of all the other specifications, that's where things go a little dark. So they are 9th generation Intel, so that means theoretically you can actually get up to a Core i7H series according to the manual I found online, but they do not give a comprehensive list of CPUs, so you really need to make sure that you know exactly what it is that you're buying. So for example, in this one, we only have a Core i5 and 4 gigs of RAM. We do, however, thankfully have an NVIDIA GTX 1650 in here, which is going to have, I believe, 4 gigabytes of dedicated memory. And officially it can handle up to 16 gigabytes of DDR4, but obviously more might be available. I was told on my spec sheet that 8 of these were soldered to the board. However, on this one, we only have 4 being listed. So that means that either 4 or 8 is soldered on and there's 2 different configurations, or maybe there's 2 sockets and the information that I have was for a slightly different variant. And that's one of the reasons that we're going to dive into this, is because there are some good specs, but the uncertainty of what exactly it is that's out there can be really frustrating. And there are other companies that this happens to as well, where if you're buying used, you want to know exactly what specifications came with these machines so you know exactly what it is that you're buying. If not, you don't really have any reference guide, and things can be a little bit more Wild Westy when it comes to purchasing something that might be in what you actually want it to be. The whole thing's being driven by my records by a 42 watt hour 3-cell battery, and that should do fairly well. Now, let's take a quick tour of the machine. This is a Canadian multilingual keyboard, so this one was very likely to be sold in Canada. And there's a couple of giveaways, like the dual language on the cap locks key, as well as en français. We also see that our sticker down here is in French first, which I think is another indicator that it was probably maybe even sold in Quebec. Or maybe New Brunswick, I don't know. We do have a standard web camera and microphone array at the top, nothing special there. And we do have a fingerprint reader built into the large touchpad down here as well. The keyboard is nothing to write home about. It is a standard ASUS chiclet keyboard that pokes through the top deck. Maybe when we open it up, we might be able to see if this is replaceable or if it's just plastic welded to the top case. My guess is probably the latter. What we're actually going to do is shut this thing down, and we are going to do a tour of the ports, and then we're going to disassemble it, and then we're going to talk about probably the biggest reason that I wouldn't necessarily want to buy this computer. Ports on the left-hand side include the power supply, Ethernet port, HDMI, USB Type-C, and that's 3.1 Gen 1, and then a headphone microphone combo jack. We also have these sideward firing speakers on this chamfered edge. Along the back, we actually have 2 fan exhausts, which is supposedly going to keep the palm rest no warmer than 35 degrees, which is good if it can do that. On an i5 chipset, I imagine that's not going to be an issue anyway. And then we do have the Kensington lock slot, 2 more USB-A ports, and then a full-size SD card slot. It is worth pointing out that your SSD indicator light and your charging indicator light are on this side. For whatever reason that I cannot quite understand, the charge indicator light is not on the same side as the power plug, which seems like an oversight. And then on the bottom, on the front edge here, we have absolutely nothing. So we're going to go ahead and flip this over and open this thing up, and we're going to talk about one of the main reasons why I would probably avoid buying this computer, and it's just a good lesson overall for when you're looking for a good deal on a used machine. Now, if you can get it for the right price, then hey, you go ahead and do you. In this instance, though, if you search for this model on eBay, for example, you will find practically no machines for sale, and you will find just as many parts. And it's going to be mostly screens, which means that if you ever have to do any work on this thing, you're probably just going to throw it in the bin. You're not going to bother to do any real restorative work to it unless you have like another exact model and you can cannibalize that for parts. And I suspect that's probably what happened to this one. So we've got a series of screws that were removed from the bottom, 2 from the back, 2 from underneath what would have been rubber feet, and then 2 from the front. Looking at the plastic casing here, we're going to grab our inexpensive pry tool, which of course is a used gift card, and just run it along the back to get some of these clips to let go. And then we're going to turn it on its side and just peel that off. That was really easy. So on the inside, what do we got here? Well, we do have our massively generous fans. So that whole thing about keeping the palm rest cool is probably possible. The other thing to think about too is where the palm rest is here. There's nothing really to get warm. So I think that's a very easy promise to keep, and I don't necessarily know if it has to do with these fans, because the palm rest literally stops and starts right underneath the motherboard, or before the motherboard. So marketing, don't know. We do see soldered on RAM underneath what would be your only RAM slot. So that means that the spec sheet that I had that says it was 8 soldered on, not true. You can also definitely get 4, which makes me wonder if you can get 16 soldered on. I suspect not. I suspect 8 is the maximum, theoretically, with you putting another stick of 8 for that total of 16. Moving right along, we do have a separate daughter board here for the USB and SD cards, which is connected to a ribbon on the upper side of the board here and on the underside of the board here. The good news is this would still be very easy to remove with these 2 screws here, one for the fan and one just directly in, and you would undo the ribbon cable here. You don't need to undo the ribbon cable underneath. We do have a Wi-Fi card that is kind of precarious in the sense that it's attached to the board and then it's attached to a screw post and there's absolutely nothing underneath. We do have an M.2 SSD 2280 millimeter, and I suspect it is NVMe capable. And we also have a bay here for an additional 2.5-inch SATA drive, and it looks like your additional connector is located right here. So you would need to buy a special part, essentially, if it didn't already come with it, for a ribbon cable to go to that SATA connector to power and read the data from the drive. Hopefully you would be able to find out what part that is without too much difficulty. And again, that's the problem that I have with this machine, is parts availability is kind of at a wild west unknown. I don't actually know if you can get parts for these because I didn't see them on eBay. So you might really have to do some digging there. Over here under this protective shield, we have one of the cables for the fan assembly, and we also have the display cable connector there as well. We have likely the keyboard connector here, which I don't have any reason to believe is backlit, because usually the backlight is a separate ribbon cable there. And we do have the heatsink solution for the CPU, and I'm guessing the GPU back here, with 2 heat pipes, one going to each one of the fans. It is kind of interesting how that heat is being directed from this part, where it's going to heat up first, travel across a chip that is already going to be generating its own heat before making it through the channel where you've got the cool air being sucked in from the bottom and blown out the back. So I'm not sure how effective the cooling solution would be, but again, for the i5, you probably don't have a whole heck of a lot to worry about. The whole machine is made out of plastic components. You don't have carbon fiber or magnesium or anything like that being used here. So overall, It's not a badly designed machine. It seems like they did put some thought into it, but the rare or lack of availability of parts kind of makes it a moot point, because you probably have to buy another non-working machine to fix the one that you have, unless you got very lucky on eBay. That's one of the unfortunate pieces with some of these consumer grade machines, is that sometimes parts just simply aren't there when you need them, especially when a machine may not have been that popular to begin with. So I'm going to go ahead and throw the cover back on, and we're going to quickly do some conclusions. Alright, so overall, one of these machines is what I would really call a plastic fantastic. It is mostly plastic. It might have some fantastic specs if you get it with the i7, 16 gigs of RAM. That GTX is going to be good for some moderate gaming, but it all comes down to the price point and whether or not you have to put any work into it. If you're on a stretched budget, you need that dedicated GPU, you can find one of these for a couple $100, then sure, it will be fun probably for a short amount of time. If you take really, really good care of it, it might last. The screen's going to underwhelm with the brightness, especially the color accuracy, but that cooling solution might allow the components to run just a little bit longer and a little bit warmer. All right, ladies and gentlemen, I hope you enjoyed this briefer look at a machine like this. Again, I don't think there's a whole lot to really say, other than this is one of those things that if you research, you might find something else to buy, unless it's a really good deal. Like, the deal quotient always needs to come into play. If you enjoy this sort of content, I would encourage you to do a couple things that support the channel, and I'll leave them over here in the corner. Or if you want to check out some of the other videos I've produced, you might find those interesting as well. Thank you so much, and I'll see you next time.